Well, today's a first for Ancient DOS games as we're going to take a look at two games in one episode, Line Wars and Line Wars II. I decided to combine both games into one episode because there's not too much to say about Line Wars II, and even less about the original. These games stand out more so in terms of their technical capabilities, rather than in terms of story or gameplay. The story for the first Line Wars is simply that the galaxy's declared war on you, so you have to defend yourself as long as possible, and the story for Line Wars II is kinda like Star Wars meets Star Trek, which would technically form a rupture in the space-time continuum, since the two entities can't exist within the same sentence without generating an imbalance of nerd radiation, which would invariably cause an increase in tachyon levels and lead to a quantum destabilization of the inherent local metronization fields. Okay, even for me, that was way too much nerding out in one sentence. So let's just move on to the game stats for the first Line Wars game. Line Wars was created by Patrick Alto and released to the public in 1989. It's a 1-to-4 player first-person space shooter featuring support for multiple graphics modes and PC speaker sound. The best graphics mode available, and the one it should default to, is its EGA 640x350 16 color mode, though you can use command line parameters to check out the other modes if you really want to. As for its release date, I don't have a clue. If you go to Patrick Alto's website, he offers the full version of Line Wars 2 for free now, but doesn't have a download for the first Line Wars game, yet the unregistered version of the first Line Wars game is not limited in any way. So if you really want to try the first Line Wars game, just search the net for the unregistered version, which is actually easier said than done. The best way to find a download for the unregistered version of Line Wars is to search the net for the zip file it was distributed as, which is lwr152.zip. So as you can see, the first Line Wars game is incredibly simple. The galaxy wants you dead, you don't agree, shoot everything. The gameplay is very much inspired by an even older space simulation game called Elite, right down to the strange control setup where you can pitch up and down and roll side to side, but you can't turn left or right. It's a control scheme that I've never really been able to get used to, and is the one thing that's kept me from really getting into the old Elite games. Unlike Elite though, which has an elaborate trading system, jumping between star systems, docking with star bases, etc., Line Wars is nothing more than shoot to kill. To do this, you get a laser system and a set of 4 missiles, which you should actually save for emergency situations only, since you can't replenish them. Survive as long as possible and get as high a score as you can, even though the score isn't shown on screen anywhere. Below the main 3D display are 3 smaller displays showing you your stats, radar, and terminal. Your stats include your current speed, your laser energy levels, your shield levels, your fuel levels, and the number of missiles you have left. Speed determines how fast you're moving. If you run out of laser energy, they'll fritz out during an attack, doing much less damage. If you run out of shields, you die. And your fuel gauge was sabotaged by pirates and hasn't worked for the last 15 solar years. Fortunately, you installed some Mark 12 interstellar RAM scoops just days prior to the galaxy turning on you, so you doubt you'll ever have to worry about fuel again. I'm just making all that up. The fuel gauge is never programmed in and thus it never shows anything. The radar is a typical space game radar with T-shaped lines showing you where something is in relation to you, including how much you have to climb or dive to see them. The terminal screen is where messages will appear, either generated by the game or typed by you to your opponents during a multiplayer match. One thing I found interesting is that this game supports up to 4 players in one match, but it doesn't have networking support. It can only connect via a modem. So to actually have more than 2 players in one game, you needed to connect to a BBS which had a Line Wars server running. BBS bulletin board systems were basically places you could dial into with a modem to chat with other people, upload and download files, and even play games either directly on the terminal display itself or using separate programs while your BBS connection was active. The internet eventually put an end to BBSs, but they were definitely a neat thing at the time. If you're going to actually try Line Wars out, there's 3 things you gotta know. Firstly, there's no standard PC joystick support built in, so you have to use DOSBox's keymapper if you want to play the game with a joystick on a modern system. Secondly, don't crash into things, because you'll almost certainly die in an instant. And lastly, one very helpful hint to keep you from being killed is that you can use the F1 and F2 keys to change between forward and rear views, and both your lasers and missiles work in both view modes. In fact, using the rear view is a very helpful way of blasting down missiles that are chasing you. Oh, and you can leave the cycles count set to auto or max without any issues. Now, let's move on to Line Wars II. Before I get into the game stats for LineWars II, I have an interesting piece of trivia here. This game was written entirely in assembly language. If you know what that means, then yeah, I'm being serious. If you don't know what it means, then I'll make it simple for you. Whenever a programmer writes a program, they have to compile it, which means turning all the lines of code they've written into huge quantities of raw machine codes, which is what actually drives the computer and tells it what to do. Assembly is just one step above handwriting the machine codes from scratch. Usually the reason someone will program something in this way is because they not only want full control over everything, they also want their software to run as fast as possible. And LineWars II can hit some of the most insane frame rates I've ever seen, which is both a blessing and a curse, and you'll see why in a moment. Now let's roll in the game stats. LineWars II was also developed by Patrick Alto, but by this time he had started a company called Safari Software, and thus published the game under the Safari banner in 1994. It's a 1 to 4 player first-person space shooter, as before, featuring support for multiple 256 color graphics modes and multiple sound cards. Now, it's hard to recommend a specific graphics mode because the effectiveness of your controls is directly related to your frame rate, and if the frame rate's too high, then errors crop up in the integer math being used and your ship simply doesn't turn properly. The MCGA 320x200 and VGA 320x480 modes are locked to the screen refresh, whereas the higher SVGA 640x480 and 800x600 modes are not. So you can either go for consistent controls or better graphics. DOSBox lets you set fixed cycles counts, so I find the latter option to be acceptable. Granted, I can't get either 800x600 mode working. As for the sound, this is probably one of the very few times I will ever recommend using the Kovac sound support with DOSBox. This is because LineWars II suffers audio glitches with its Sound Blaster support in DOSBox, and the Gravis ultrasound support sounds muted for some reason. As for its current release date, this game is definitely freeware now, and you can download it directly from Patrick Alto's website at linewars.patrickalto.com. So unlike LineWars I, LineWars II has more of a story to bridge its 9 missions together. Basically, you take the role of a rookie fighter pilot who's recently obtained their license and got assigned to a remote outpost in the obscure Deneb star system, sharing their free time only with a space captain by the name of Winobi and a 110-year-old cyborg named Sir Dak Wintal. You're chilling out in this boring location when suddenly the Space Watch sensors pick up a storm of asteroids heading for the starbase. Before launch, Captain Winobi promises to recommend you to the Royal Guard if you successfully clear the asteroids away, and thus begins your trek through a paper-thin story of princesses, pirates, and alien takeovers. I mean really, this isn't Elite. There's only one reason and one reason alone why you're playing this game. You want to shoot things. Unlike the first LineWars II is dressed up a lot more nicely and has some fairly epic battles in store for you. But there's two things that really separate this game from similar offerings. The first is that instead of facing each mission just once, since each mission is basically just a battle, you actually play every mission multiple times, with each subsequent attempt becoming harder and harder by having more and more enemies. Sometimes some more friendlies to keep the balance. The other thing that really sets this game apart is the emergency teleporter. At any point in time, including automatically when you die, you can teleport over to another friendly vessel and take command of it. Because of this, you cannot lose a mission until every ship on your side is destroyed, or a key target you had to protect goes down. Considering the massive quantities of ships you can fight in a single mission, this is an essential feature. There's also several kinds of ships you can take command of, including Cobra fighters, pirate fighters, and space cruisers. The Cobra and pirate fighters aren't really too different from each other, but the cruisers are interesting. In earlier missions, they're heavily armored, but not heavily armed. Whereas in the final mission, your cruisers get rapid-fire lasers that can burn through most enemies in seconds. You also get to fight against super-powered alien cruisers, but I have yet to find a way to actually fly one in this game. The graphics are monochrome, but have an interesting twist to them, in that they try to simulate space lighting as accurately as possible. Basically, any surface that's facing the sun you can see easily. Any surface opposite of the sun will be pretty close to pitch black. In fact, you can make it pitch black if you really want to, because you can adjust the ambient light level. One very neat difference from the original LineWars is the way damage works. This time around, you have front and rear shields, which slowly regenerate, armor for each quadrant of your ship, which does not regenerate, and 8 various systems that can take damage when you're hit on a lowly armored section. If your lasers are damaged, you'll barely be able to get any shots off. If your missiles are damaged, then firing missiles takes numerous attempts before one will launch. If your shields are damaged, they'll only recharge up to a very low level. If your thrusters are damaged, your top speed will be cut down significantly. If your radar is damaged, you won't be able to see what's going on around you. If your communications are damaged, you won't get any communication messages on screen. If your controls are damaged, you'll shake around violently, making it very difficult to target things, let alone move. And lastly is your hull, which is special in that if it gets damaged once, you're still okay, but if it gets damaged twice, that's when you die. This makes things interesting because once your shields and armor are gone, you could die from the very next 2 hits, or it could take a dozen or more attacks before you'll go down. The radar's been changed too, this time to a forward-looking variant where anything in the middle of the radar is directly in front of you and anything around the ring on the edge is either beside or behind you. It's a very simple radar to work with considering the nature of the battles in this game. Also, you can activate a rear view just like in the original Line Wars, but unfortunately your lasers and missiles only work in the forward view. Now, the biggest tip I can give for anyone playing this game is to use missiles aggressively and abuse the emergency teleport feature so you can use the missiles stocked by your other friendly ships. In fact, this is pretty much a required practice because the further you get in a mission, the more enemies you'll face each time, yet the number of friendly ships doesn't increase at the same rate, meaning it gets easier and easier for the enemies to just annihilate everyone. Another big tip I can give is specifically directed towards the first mission of the game, where you're defending your starbase from the asteroids. Just get out in front of the base a couple or so kilometers, come to a dead stop, turn around, and just blast the asteroids that are closest to the base. It works every time. Lastly, I mentioned before that the frame rate affects how well you can control your ship. Well, this affects the other ships too, not just yourself. And if you try playing the game with various frame rates going, you'll notice that it changes the dynamics of a mission quite a bit. Especially in the last battle, since the cruisers can't turn that well to begin with, and with the frame rate soaring, you'll be lucky if you can get them to turn at all. But then, the alien cruisers you're fighting against are in the same predicament. One curious thing about the networking support in LineWars II for multiplayer gameplay is that it works not through IPX, not through TCP/IP, not even through NetBIOS, but through file sharing. I'm serious, the way it works is that a special DOS-based file sharing program has to be run and a shared drive has to be set up that multiple computers can access at will. LineWars II then constantly reads and writes data from this drive letter at the same time everyone else is, and thus it doesn't matter what kind of network you have set up, so long as each computer can access that same network drive. It's kind of an ingenious way of doing it, but I don't have a clue how to make it work in DOSBox, since LineWars II needs to see the DOS file sharing program active to work. So just like with the first Line Wars game, getting more than 2 players going requires kind of outdated design principles, so your best bet for multiplayer is just one-on-one through a modem or direct serial link with a COM port. As for setting up LineWars II in DOSBox, there's really not much to say, and I'm kinda caught in the gravity well of the sun, so I better get this over with quickly. If you plan to use the MCGA or VGA low resolution modes, then leave the cycles count set to auto or max. If you intend to play using a higher resolution SVGA mode, then the lack of vertical retrace synchronization, combined with the subtle arithmetic errors in the algorithms used in the game, means you'll have to set a fixed cycles count, and I recommend a number around 20,000. Oh yeah, and of course, leave the graphics killers off, since 3D games like this one never really benefit from them. Anyways, that's all for this episode of Ancient DOS Games. Stay tuned for episode 35, where we're gonna zone some land, raise some taxes, and then set everything on fire just for the heck of it. If you know which game lets you do all that, and I'm sure most of you do, then send your guests to adg@pixelships.com and make sure you tune in next Saturday to watch everything burn. Wait, did I just fly straight through the sun? And live? But space is a cruel place sometimes. Can't even get incinerated by the sun.